this is Ross Harrison with Precision Health and Fitness. And today we're talking about hamstrings. So, hamstrings are one of those muscles that a lot of people seem to injure, and there's a lot of reasons for it, but honestly, I think some of it is just because people don't really stretch correctly. And all stretching is very individual, and there's some ways that aren't good or are. With the hamstrings, there's so many different ways to stretch them, and they're usually tight in almost everybody, so almost anything you do can give you a stretch sensation, but some stretches are much healthier and much more effective than others. So I'm a big fan of starting with the basics, and if the basics are good enough for you to give you a good stretch, stick with those until they become easier or where you don't feel very much, and then you can go to more advanced ones. With hamstrings, like this is just a good starter. So if generally I'll keep my feet apart about a little past hip width. You can do them with your feet closer or wider, and depending on how your hips are and your hip flexibility, it's just sort of play around with it and feel what feels good. So if I'm standing with my feet apart, all you have to do is lean over. And for most people, they'll feel either a stretch in their low back or their hamstrings or even their calves if they're really tight. And just letting your body hang can be a good stretch. The important thing is the knees. So with any of these, you never want to be totally locked. You never want your knees locked. You don't want to bend over and feel pressure going into your knees. By the same token, when you bend over, you don't want your knees to bend either, because the more your knee bends, the less your hamstring actually stretches. So if your hamstrings are really tight and you start bending over and you can't help but bend your knees more, just know that the goal is not to get as low to the ground. Or a lot of people love to do this and force themselves to touch their toes. If I have to just do a bunch of stuff just to touch my toes, it's not a goal. That doesn't make the stretch better. So generally, I always focus on just, if you want to lock your knees for a second, just to feel what it feels like to be locked, and then just unlock just a little. And if you can hold that position, that's pretty much going to be your best stretch. So from there, as you lean over, just be really aware of that. And also, for different people, leaning over can be problematic as far as the low back goes. Go by how it feels. But regardless, when you do lean over, just relax. Don't fight it, but you can keep some lower abdominal tension if you're feeling your back at all. But otherwise, just let gravity do the work and just hang and just relax. And if this doesn't do anything for your hamstrings, no problem. I've got one that's more intense. But for a lot of people, this does give them a stretch. And then you can also, I'll keep my hands together just to give myself a visual. You can have both hands go towards one foot. And same thing with the other foot. If you want, you can just go back and forth slowly. I'm not a fan of the bouncing back and forth from toe to toe or bouncing a lot, especially with vulnerability of the back in that position. But that's just a simple basic stretch. And the other important thing, especially for anybody who has low back issues, when you come up, don't just pull your head up and a lot of people talk about this, but really just think about rolling up your spine, just stacking your vertebrae on top of each other. And it doesn't necessarily do much with the stretch, but it's much easier on your back. So that's the basic stretch. For most people, especially if you do a lot of stretching or any significant amount of stretching, I like to do, and you can use any height type item. You can definitely hold on if you want to. As I've said before and I'll say again, stretching is not a balance activity. So whatever you need to do to feel comfortable and relax, but have one foot elevated, the other foot on the ground. And if you need to hold on, please do. So from this position, same thing. You definitely don't want to lock your knee in this position. Just keep a little bend and try to hold it. So often when I see this stretch, you see this kind of thing. It's same as on the floor. People are reaching for their toes, they're trying to grab and pull, and then usually this kind of position ends up where you're bending your knee to grab your, just that amount of knee bend takes a lot of the benefit of the hamstring stretch away, or it just means you have to go even further to get the same stretch. The knee and the leg, like really, I feel like this is a secret, or people know it but they don't really apply it. The hip is what matters, and a lot of times people don't think about stretching like what things are connecting to, but essentially your hamstring connects your hip and your knee, and we're always focused on the knee so much that people don't think about what the hip's doing when they're stretching. So a lot of times, in order to try to stretch better, the hip will like rotate under, and then they'll curve a lot with their back and allow the hip to rotate in a way that actually takes tension off the hamstring. But sort of like stretching 101, if you pull the two endpoints of the muscle further apart, you get a stretch. But when a lot of people are stretching their hamstrings, they actually might be pulling one part further apart and they're bringing the other one closer, also inhibiting the stretch. So if you can keep just a tiny bit of bend in the knee, try focusing on not leaning forward, but just keeping a good neutral hip, and actually rotate your pelvis backward. So and you can see my leg moves back a little bit. And it's just that one tiny hip motion greatly increases the stretch of the hamstring. Like just doing that stretches that more than doing that, or at least as much. And one requires a lot more motion of other things. So if you can just do a little motion that greatly increases the stretch, doesn't put load on your spine or take you out of posture, that to me is significantly better. But there is something of visual of touching your feet or touching your toes or grabbing like you've succeeded, but just think about what gives you the best stretch. And yes, if you tilt your pelvis back and it lengthens your leg and you still don't feel much, then you can lean forward, but you don't have to bend and do that. Just keep your spine straight and just lean forward a little bit, and that stretch, it was actually getting a little too intense. But that stretch will be significantly more, and that's all you need. There's no, granted, of course, if you do a ton of flexibility and you're a gymnast or done a lot of yoga, you may need more, but focus on the hip and getting a little motion in the hip, and you'll feel it. You will definitely feel an increase in stretch and tension under the leg, and that's what you want. Of course, as with all these, don't push it. Like feeling just as much intensity as you can in the stretch is not always a good thing, but feeling enough that it feels like you're actually stretching, that's good. And then once you've got that, just normal, hold it 10 to 15 or 15 to 30 seconds, somewhere in there, whatever feels good. And that's it. Like those, for the most part, those stretches will be enough. If you're more advanced and like that stretch doesn't do it for you, this video is not for you anyway. But most people are not anywhere near there. And like that stretch, if people have hip control, and it's also good for training that and just feeling like just the pelvic tilt, it's essentially that kind of motion that you're going for. That's what makes the stretch work really well. And so yeah, if you're doing a lot of running or using your legs a lot, stretch your hamstrings, stretch your quads, stretch your hamstrings. Should be pretty much in everybody's program. Those are simple. Like a couple weeks ago, I did the quad stretches, I believe, and releases, and I'm gonna take a quick break. I will be right back, and I'll do some other releases.